Hello, welcome to the video. This one is on genetically modified organisms, specifically the crops. I'm going to start out with this nice question here. Why would we want to modify something? So what's kind of the point? There's a lot of science and research and money that goes into developing these crops. So why do we do them? And one of the reasons is for better crop yield, especially under harsh conditions. We can make them drought resistant. Ones that can survive in climates that are more arid than typical. And so by doing that, by making an organism that's capable of surviving in those areas, we're increasing our yields. We can grow more food, and with a growing population, that's always a good thing. We can also make herbicide and disease resistant. So you might ask yourself, herbicides, these are made to kill plants. Why would we want to make organisms that can withstand herbicides? And the reason is, if we're growing crops, we're going to want to keep that crop as our only plant that we're growing. And so nature is going to try to bring other plants in, some weeds and stuff. And so if our crops are resistant to the herbicides, I can spray all the herbicide I want and it'll kill everything but my crop. Disease resistance is also helpful, right? You lose less of your crop, especially if you're operating a really heavy monoculture. A disease could run through it really rapidly and wipe out the whole thing. So if we can build this into the crop, and allow the plant to produce its own disease resistance, that will help us out in the long run. We can also do it for nutrition or pharmaceuticals. And so one of the really wonderful ideas is this vaccine delivery. And what that would entail would be creating plants that produce compounds found in the vaccines. And so for the third world, the developing world, that would allow us to get the vaccines to the people in the food that they're eating. And so it could potentially reduce a lot of problems with those diseases like polio and things that we can vaccinate for. And Roundup Ready is a term you're going to hear a lot of, and I'll get to that in a second. Why might we want to avoid them? So it is kind of a hot button issue, and if you mention GMOs to the wrong person, you might be in for a really long discussion on why they're a terrible thing. So why might we not like the GMOs? One of the environmental concerns is that we might put them a pesticide resistance in them, or a pesticide itself into the plant's genetic makeup, and then the plant will begin producing it. That could potentially harm beneficial insects. The big worry in terms of this are bees, right? Are we going to increase the rate at which we're killing all the bees? And if GMOs were found to do something along those lines, it would be a pretty devastating discovery. Another problem is super pests and weeds. And so if we're putting the gene to be resistant to the pesticide into our crops, and that gene somehow gets out of the crop and into the weeds, right? So the gene out of our crop into the weeds, that could create an herbicide resistant superweed, one that we would not be able to eliminate with our usual means. And so that's a concern too, is that gene going to migrate into the weeds. Health risks are another big concern that people have, and this is a very hot issue here in terms of labeling. And so currently GMOs do not need to be labeled in the United States, and you're not going to be told if your food has a GMO. If it's GMO free, certified GMO free, you'll probably see a label on there, but they're not going to advertise, hey, my food's got genetically modified corn in it, because they're going to lose out on some of their buyers. Some people aren't familiar with GMOs and they probably wouldn't buy it. And they might have very good reasons. The health risks are pretty unknown. They haven't been around a long time, and they were kind of just introduced to the public rather than undergoing testing, because chemically it's still the same plant, but now it's producing some other compounds. And so people really question whether they're safe. And then another big thing is the economic risk down here, with this being the big issue. The GMO seeds are patented, and so what that means is if you buy the Roundup Ready corn, for example, if you want to plant your corn next year, corn's an annual crop, meaning it needs planted every year, you have to buy your seeds again. And if there's a patent on that seed, you can only buy it from one person, and that's bordering on a monopoly there. And they kind of dictate the prices for it, which makes it tough for smaller farmers to stay competitive with those larger multinational food producers. So the Roundup Ready gene, this is probably the most famous form of genetically modification. It happens in a couple of different plant species, but essentially Roundup is Monsanto's, and I'll spell that here for you, Monsanto. Roundup's their herbicide. It's a broadleaf herbicide. It is short-lived, and it needs to be sprayed on a plant that is actively growing. And essentially what it does is it's absorbed into the leaf of the plant, and once it's absorbed into the leaf of the plant, it prevents it from creating 3 essential amino acids. And without those amino acids, the plant cells can't reproduce, and so it dies. And so Roundup is a really efficient herbicide. The problem is it needs constant application because every time a new plant grows, you have to spray it again. It doesn't create like a barrier on the soil that prevents plants from coming in. It only kills the growing plants. The Roundup Ready gene is a gene that has been spliced into certain crops, and it creates a resistance to Roundup. And so if you're growing a field of corn, you no longer need to worry about the weeds and stuff infiltrating your field and reducing your yields. You can just spray Roundup like nobody's business, and it'll eliminate everything but the corn. And so this one is advertised to require less tilling. It preserves soil fertility because you don't till the soil and break it up, and so it doesn't erode away as much. And so that's kind of the benefits of Roundup Ready. How does it happen? There's a couple of different ways we do GMOs. So we've been genetically modifying organisms since we've undergone agriculture. And it's through selective breeding is kind of the ancient way. And what this would be is you would harvest your field. The plants that you liked, actually we go back even further to the hunter-gatherers. The plants that the hunter-gatherers liked would bring them back to their little huts. They would eat them and then throw the waste out. And that waste were the seeds and stuff. And so this began agriculture. Those seeds started to grow and they could harvest them. And eventually you end up turning something that looks like this, the wild ancestor of corn, into something that looks like this, today's modern day corn. And what it is you're just selectively breeding the larger kernels, the bigger cobs produced over and over and over this period of 7,000 years, and you create something that has been genetically modified. It's been selected to grow these nice, big, juicy, starch and sugar-filled kernels that taste good and give us lots of energy. Another way we can do is some advanced breeding. And so in this term, we're looking for these really desirable traits. And once we find those traits in plants, we are crossbreeding them to show them off or to kind of exaggerate them. And when we do that, we're going to create plants that grow a little bit taller. You might see this as hybrid vigor. These plants have those selective traits bred for, and we can ensure that they're there. And then the very last part is the GM plant breeding. And in GM plant breeding, this is where we're taking a gene from something else, right here, some other plant or some other animal even, and imprinting it into the DNA of the plant that we're modifying. And so we can really pull in some interesting characteristics into these plants. This is how that third way is done. And so this is using restriction enzymes. And so we've got a cell with the DNA we like. We're going to extract the DNA and put it into a plasmid. And so this plasmid is found in a certain form of bacteria. Usually you're going to see it abbreviated BT. And so if you see BT corn, it's one that has this in it. And once they get that section of DNA implanted into the plasmid, they put it back into the bacterial cell. And the bacteria has this special feature where it implants that section of DNA into plants. And so they allow it to go to work on plant matter, and that plant matter is grown in a medium until we produce these viable plants, and the seeds are then sold, and we end up with genetically modified corn. Some of the bigger examples of GMOs that you should be aware of are on this slide here. The first one's the Flavor Saver tomato, and what they introduced into this was a gene that delayed the ripening process of it, so it stayed nice, bright, and red longer. It also was claimed to be tastier and fresher than your average tomato. And so this one was a big seller because tomatoes don't last long on the shelves. And so grocery stores really liked it. They could hold them longer. they could transport them further, and they looked nicer, and so they sold more of them. Golden rice is one that hasn't actually been grown in large quantities yet, more as a research type of deal. But essentially, it's rice that grows its own beta carotene inside the rice, which converts in our bodies to vitamin A. And vitamin A is a really big issue in the developing world, especially in like Southeast Asia areas. And vitamin A malnourishment, if you don't get enough vitamin A in your diet, it can lead towards blindness and kind of some growth deficiencies. And so the idea is if we create golden rice that produces its own vitamin A and introduce it into these areas that have very heavy rice diets, it can give us a solution to a health problem. BT corn, this is the one that I was talking about earlier. BT corn has a chemical that's normally found in certain bacteria that is toxic to insects. And so BT corn is essentially producing its own pesticide, and that pesticide prevents a type of beetle and worm from getting into the stalks and eating the kernels of corn before they're ready to harvest. And so if an insect eats it, it dies. And so you end up having a much higher yield, and you don't have to worry about spraying pesticides because now the plant's producing its own. And then we talked pretty extensively on the Roundup Ready. The big two for Roundup Ready are corn and soybeans, but there's also others that have it. And so this list that I've got here, this is all the genetically modified crops that exist right now. Recently, the FDA just approved the production of genetically modified salmon called the Aqua Advantage salmon. The Aqua Advantage salmon has a gene from a deep sea fish called a pout implanted in it, and that gene tells the salmon to grow year round, when typically salmons only grow certain times of the year. And so these salmon grow much larger than the native salmon. It's not in production yet, but these are all of them that are. So you don't have to memorize these by any stretch, but I thought they were kind of interesting, some of the things that we can put into these plants. And then the very last part that I want to mention here is where do we find these GMOs? And so some areas are really anti-GMO, and others are really pro-GMO. USA kind of leads the front in GMO production. We produce a lot of genetically modified crops. In fact, I would be shocked if anyone in the room has not eaten any genetically modified crops because corn is so prevalently used, and we create so much genetically modified corn. Countries in Europe, there are some countries in Europe that generally don't like the GMOs and will reject genetically modified. China is the same way. And so there are no proven health risks for genetically modified organisms, but there's also a lot of suspicion. The research is pretty limited, and that's generally the reason why people cite they don't like the GMOs. That's all I've got for you on genetically modified organisms. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be watching Harvest of Fear, which is a PBS documentary on genetically modified organisms, and this should all kind of tie in nicely with it. So please come with some questions. Be prepared to discuss, especially we'll do some pros and cons for the golden rice and hopefully turn into a nice big discussion. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.